Okay, good morning and happy Thursday. It's my great pleasure to welcome all of you to today's symposium commemorating 30th anniversary of the Walter Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center. My name is Gyuk Shin, and it has been my true honor to serve as our center's director since 2005. It's already like 8-9 years since I began this job. So this year also quite meaningful for me personally because I came to United States in 1983, exactly 30 years ago, to begin graduate school at the University of Washington. At the time, I had no idea that many visionary faculty at Stanford were organizing and establishing this wonderful center to dedicate promoting understanding of contemporary Asia and to fostering stronger U.S.-Asia relations. At the lunch panel, we will listen to founding directors and other former directors about history of our center. Since that time, there has been a tremendous change in Asia from the steady rise of China's economy to the democratization and growth of Korea. Shorenstein APAC has anticipated many of these developments and responded to them through its research and publishing. We have also hosted and built many ties with hundreds of visiting scholars, fellows, and practitioners from Asia over the years. I'm happy to see some of our former fellows joining us today at the symposium. As you know, earlier this year, we kicked off our 30th anniversary with UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon's visit, and we are happy to continue our celebration today with many programs. As you can see from our program, we will have 3 panels today. The first one will look at the past 30 years of economic, security, and social changes in Asia. We will soon turn to the first panel. And then over lunch, we will have all the former directors of the center to share their thoughts and reflections over our center's history. And I'm very happy to have all the former directors in today's symposium, especially panel over lunch. And the third one, we will discuss development in U.S.-Asia relations with a focus on U.S., Korea, Japan, China, and Southeast Asia. Before concluding my remarks, I'd like to thank our panelists, especially those coming from Asia, to join us, our celebration today, and also the committee at the center to prepare for this symposium and other events. The committee was chaired by Michael Amakost, and I really appreciate him and other committee members, and also our professional dedicated staff. So once again, thank you for joining us on this important day in our center's history. And I'm sure you will all enjoy our program throughout the day. And I also look forward to celebrating our 30th anniversary. Thanks again. I look forward to talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Gyuk. It gives me great pleasure to be able to chair the first panel on Asia's transformation. Now, this transformation, many of you have personally witnessed this transformation. Some of you, came from, Giwok was talking about how he came to the United States 30 years ago. But for others that may not have grown up in Asia but have gone to Asia over these many decades, the changes have been very dramatic. And it continues to be one of the fastest growing areas and fastest changing areas, I think, in the world. Now, the panel that I am chairing, we have a pretty difficult task to try to sum up 3 decades of change across Asia is pretty difficult. But we are very fortunate because we have 3 very prominent experts that will be talking about different aspects of this change. Now, we clearly can't talk about everything, but we are going to divide the discussion into 3 spheres: economic, strategic, and social. And for each of these spheres, we have one of the leading experts in each area. So let me just briefly give an introduction to each of them. There's a full biography of each of our speakers, so I'm just going to touch on a few highlights. Our first speaker will be Professor Lawrence Lau. Larry joined Stanford back in the 1966 as an assistant professor, and he went on to become the first K.T. Lee professor in economics. He also was a co-director of what was then called the Asia Pacific Research Center. And then he eventually retired from Stanford and then went on to become the vice chancellor of Chinese University of Hong Kong, where he is currently the Ralph and Clara Landau Professor of Economics at Chinese University. And then for our session on our discussion about strategy and security, we have Dr. Michael Armacost. He's a political scientist by training, started out teaching at Pomona College, but then was called into the government, first the State Department, and then he, over the next 24 years, assumed a number of very important and sensitive positions, including in the Defense Department, National Security Council, and then went on to become the ambassador both to Philippines and then to Japan, as well as then becoming the president of Brookings before joining Stanford. And then finally, on society, we have one of our, Joshua Guang, who is one of the leading sociologists studying China. He is now the second K.T. Lee professor in economic development. He has written a lot on organization of Chinese society, and he currently has been doing work on the rise of the bureaucratic state. So with these 3 specialists, we're going to be trying to give you some of the highlights of the transformation. What are some of the most important points of this transformation over the last 3 decades and what the implications are of these changes. And the procedure, since we're the first panel, I was told I have to be really strict here. So we are supposed to give each speaker 15 minutes. And I will be strict on this. And Debbie Warren is going to be holding up flashcards in the back to make sure that we stay on schedule, because we want to have some time for discussion. And so with that, I'm going to turn the time over to our speakers. So Larry, you're on first.
I will post my PowerPoint on my webpage, so you could get it later. Let me say the following. By East Asia, what I mean here is the 10 ASEAN countries plus 3, China, Japan, and Korea, and then also Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan. So that's really, when I talk about East Asia, I mean the GDP and so on, trade, I mean all this whole group together. What I'd like to do this morning is to illustrate the transformation that have occurred in East Asian economies since 1980. Now, as we all know, that the center of gravity of the world economy has been and is still in the process of shifting from the United States and Europe towards East Asia. And within the East Asian economy itself, the center of gravity is actually also beginning to shift from Japan towards China. The principal sources of economic growth have also gradually evolved. You might recall that some years ago, my colleagues and I did some research on East Asia, and we concluded that there was actually very little technical progress, that it was also, the growth was entirely input-driven. You have more capital, more labor, you have more output. But this is also beginning to change, that as you now look at economies like Korea, Singapore, and Taiwan, intangible capital, human capital, R&D capital, has actually begun to play a very important role. The East Asian economic development has also followed very much the dual economy model of W. Arthur Lewis, based on this idea that if you utilize the surplus labor in the agricultural sector and in an expanding non-agricultural sector, that's basically the formula for success. And you see that that is actually pretty much the model followed by the successful countries. Finally, I want to emphasize that the openness of the economy to international trade and development is also a very critical feature of the East Asian success. In 1980, the United States and Western Europe together accounted for over 60% of the world GDP. But you can see here, by comparison, East Asia was only about 15%. Now, and when we come to 2012, the East Asia is now actually gone up to 25%. Okay, and the United States and Europe has gone down to 45%. You can see the colors, the slices. The red color is China, and this golden color is Japan. You can see that all of this has really expanded very much during this particular period. This is an interesting graph because up there the green line is total East Asia. You can see that Japan used to be very dominant share of East Asia. And then you can see that the share of the world GDP is coming down, and then the red line is the Chinese share of GDP. At the bottom is the Korean share of world GDP. You look at the rates of growth of real GDP. I have basically the red columns are for East Asia, the blue columns for the United States, and the black columns for Europe. And you could see that except for a little stretch, during the 1997-98 East Asian crisis, that by and large East Asian economies have actually been growing faster than the United States and also faster than the Eurozone. It is also interesting to compare the average annual rates of growth for different economies decade by decade. This is what we've done here. The green columns are for 1970 to 79, and then 80 to 89, 90 to 99, and so forth. So there are 4 decades. You could see that the developed economies, namely the United States, Eurozone, and Japan, and the UK on the right, they basically, on average, they grow much slower than the East Asian economies. China is quite clear, but you also look at India. India has also been accelerating over time, and then Korea has also been going very strong. Brazil and do I have Brazil here? Yeah, Brazil and Russia mostly are doing well in the last decade, mostly because of the resource boom. In terms of improvement, you could see that what I have done here is look at the East Asian economies and before 1980 levels of GDP compared to the level of GDP today. You can see a huge improvement. Some of them don't register, but the third one is China. So you have very, very small blue column, very short blue column, and a red column. This really is the huge improvement, huge change in about 30 years. Now, the next column is Japan. Look at Japan here. Japan usually was very high in 1980. It's still very high in terms of total GDP, but the improvement is really obviously make a big difference. Now, this graph is okay. Korea also you can see a major improvement, but You can see this more clearly here when we remove, in terms of GDP, when we remove both China and Japan, the scale look better. But you can see, it's quite obvious here that over these 30 years, almost every economy make progress. I mean, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar are exceptions, but others have all been doing relatively well. Now, but in terms of GDP per capita, it's a slightly different story. China's weight here is still very low. Macau, because of the prosperity of casinos, is now has highest per capita GDP. It's actually even higher than the United States. But Brunei has oil. But you could see here that there are some well-to-do countries, Hong Kong, Japan, and Korea, and so forth. But China is very low. That's basically what I want to point out, is that in terms of per capita GDP, China is really still very low compared to many of the other East Asian countries. Now, what about trade? Let us now look a little bit about trade. And again, in 1980, the United States and Western Europe together accounted for over 60% world trade. East Asia was only about 10%. Today, the share of the US and the Western Europe combined would be about 45%. The share of East Asia has risen to 30%. So this is also a very major change. This is 1980, and this is 2011. Okay, you can see what a huge change just comparing the two pie charts. Okay, the other thing is that the rising share of East Asian trade. East Asia, 10%, is now close to 30%. Chinese trade is really very remarkable. In 1950, you can see that it's almost unchanged. From 50 to around 80, it's about 1% of world trade. It's now over 10%. So the policy of opening and reform have really made a huge difference. If you look at this. So anyway, we can also look at this chart, and it is also on trade, on growth of trade, and you can see that the story is similar, namely that the United States, Western Europe, the developed economies have relatively slow growth, but the East Asian countries have actually very rapid growth. You could look at, on the extreme left or your right is Korea, got huge growth rates, and China has rising growth rates, but even India has very, very rapidly rising, accelerating growth rates of exports. In terms of foreign exchange reserves, you could see, that the East Asian countries have really accumulated a huge amount of foreign exchange reserves. China has about 3.4 trillion, Japan has about 1.3 trillion, and then you have the other East Asian economies. They also actually have substantial reserves, but it just doesn't show up because of scale. They've also become major holders of U.S. Treasury securities. I think China and Japan are running sort of neck to neck in terms of the holdings of Treasury securities. But all of them are major holders in East Asia. One can also look at market capitalization. This is you can see here, Japan used to be very dominant in East Asia. This is market cap of the Tokyo Stock Exchange, Tokyo and Osaka Stock Exchange. But you can see in recent years, this is the Chinese stock exchanges, Shanghai and Shenzhen combined. This is Hong Kong. So things are really changed a lot in East Asia. Okay. Now, one of the things I want to get across here is this idea of partial decoupling. Okay, people really always claim that if the U.S. and the Western Europe, if they are not doing well, then the rest of the world will not do well. But that has really begun to change too. I mean, I think that I think what we have learned especially during this last crisis since 2007, is that East Asia and China can do, relatively well, even when the United States and we're in deep recession. And I think this is what gives some credence to this idea of that of partial decoupling. Yes, yeah. Okay. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is the evolving source of East Asian economic growth. Now, I think what is really interesting is the following, is that if you look at the beginning of East Asian growth, as countries started 60, 70, 80, and many of them basically rely on just accumulation of capital. So what is really driving the growth of accumulation of capital. But beginning in the 80s and 90s, what you find is that some of the more advanced countries, Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, they begin to invest in R&D. And slowly, they actually become very much, innovation becomes very important. But first of all, let's look at the savings rate. The savings rate of East Asian economy are all very high, except for Philippines. The line at the bottom is Philippines. And that has actually enabled the East Asian economy to invest a lot. They have large capital growth. And this basically gives you a picture of how savings rate, the savings rate can rise very rapidly with respect to per capita GDP. You have a real per capita GDP on the horizontal axis and the savings rate on the vertical axis. You can see very clearly that this rises very fast. And this is really what is what has been powering East Asian economic growth. But more recently, what we find is that the countries begin to increase their investment in R&D. Here you can see this is Korea, light blue. You can see that the investment in R&D from less than 0.5%, very, very low, almost zero, is now to the highest, okay, in the world in terms of percent of GDP. The golden line is Japan. It's also very high. The blue line is the United States, been high. This is China coming up very slowly. Taiwan is here. So you could see huge changes in terms of investment in what I call intangible capital. Now, why is it so important? It's important because of this graph. This is the number of patents granted versus R&D capital stock. That if you accumulate R&D investment over time with some depreciation, what you find is rather remarkable. That is, the more you invest, the more inventions you have. Okay, it's not surprising that Apple is produced in the United States, iPad, iPhone coming in the United States. It's really because of very high level of investment in R&D. Okay, now one final thing is that what I call surplus labor, and this is just want to show you a chart. Almost every economy follows this pattern, and that is the growth comes from moving labor force from agriculture to non-agriculture, and in this process, the output increases because the non-agricultural sector is much more productive. And what you actually see, this is a typical chart, is like this. This is China. The green part is agricultural share of GDP. You can see that's been declining steadily. And then you have the blue part is industry, and this is service sector. This is on GDP. This is on employment. You can see what a huge difference it estimate. And this is urbanization. So all of these things go together. Okay, that. And this is just an example. I mean, you look at most other countries, Korea, Japan, you really see that more or less the same pattern. And finally, I want to say a word about openness. Openness is very important. This is what happened to China is a huge devaluation, and that really has helped shifted to exports. This is in Taiwan, which happened earlier. But if you look at other countries, you really see the same pattern. Let me conclude by this very briefly. The center of gravity of world economy has been shifting to East Asia. Okay, center of gravity, the East Asian economy itself has been shifting towards China. The East Asian economy has been partially decoupled from the United States and Europe. The other thing that is important that has happened is that intangible capital, namely human capital and R&D capital, has been gradually supplanting tangible inputs like physical capital and labor as the most important source of growth in some East Asian economies. Okay, now this is a natural progression. If you look at the United States and ask what is the most important source of growth, it would actually be technical progress. It would be intangible capital. That is the source of growth. Finally, I want to emphasize that openness to international trade and investment is very important, and the continued expansion of the non-agricultural sector through the utilization of the surplus labor in agriculture. These are very common features of this East Asian experience, and I think we'll see more of it to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Larry. Mike?
Thank you very much. I wasn't present at the creation of APARC, but I've spent a fair amount of time here. So it's a great joy to join in this celebration of the past 30 years. I think Larry's story is a very dramatic one, and I think the strategic transformation that's taken place during the past 30 years is equally dramatic. I was posted in the Philippines 30 years ago, wondering how long the Marcos regime would survive. My talk this morning is designed to look at the drivers of strategic transformation. When APARC was getting started, Moscow was still regarded as the primary disturber in the Asia-Pacific region. The Soviet Union retained large troop deployments on the northern border of China. It was America's principal global rival. Its nuclear arsenal was second only to our own. Sino-Soviet competition allowed the North Koreans to extort money and other goods from both China and Russia. Moscow's ally in Hanoi was busy extending its influence in Cambodia, despite local resistance supported directly by Beijing and indirectly by Washington. This notwithstanding, Soviet military capabilities and political influence in Asia were distinctly limited. Its Pacific fleet was modest in size and reach. The logistic support required by its troops in Asia was challenging. Moscow's leaders were elderly and infirm. Its allies in Asia were few and far between. Its intervention in Afghanistan was turning sour, and its diplomacy was generally pretty ham-handed. China, meanwhile, despite Soviet pressure, devoted most of its energies to economic modernization. Its foreign policy generally reflected Deng Xiaoping's instincts to bide time, conceal capabilities, pile up economic achievements, keep a low profile. While China insisted on the strict regulation of U.S. arms transfers to Taiwan, Beijing's reactions to specific sales tended to be pragmatic and rather restrained. The U.S.-Japan alliance was in transition from a simple Cold War deal into a more operational alliance. Relations between our uniformed services were arm's length, to be sure. There was no joint command, there was no integration of forces, we had no joint use bases. The Japanese government assumed no security responsibilities abroad. It deployed no troops abroad. Its defense budget remained limited to 1% of its gross domestic product. But joint planning and joint exercises had commenced. Intelligence exchanges were expanding, although on a modest base. Japanese naval and air force units had recently assumed responsibility for patrolling and surveillance missions out to 1,000 miles south of Tokyo, and Prime Minister Nakasone began to identify Japan both explicitly and publicly with the wider security system of the West. In South Korea, the wounds of the Carter ground troop withdrawals had healed, but they were not forgotten. A U.S. infantry division remained stationed north of Seoul as a kind of a tripwire force. Through the Combined Forces Command, we exercised operational control over all South Korean forces. And most importantly, I suppose South Korea was beginning to completely outpace its northern neighbor in virtually every measurable dimension of national power. But this, unfortunately, did not deter Pyongyang from undertaking outrageous provocations like its terrorist attack on ROC leaders meeting in Rangoon in 1983. A revised U.S.-Philippine agreement was struck in mid-1983, which extended U.S. access to bases in Clark and Subic for another 5 years, but the assassination of Ninoy Aquino in August of that year provoked such public outrage in Manila and Washington that we began reconsidering the costs and the benefits of a long-standing strategic relationship with the country. In the wake of America's defeat in Vietnam, the domino theory proved to be the dog that didn't bark in Southeast Asia. Maritime Southeast Asian nations proved their resilience, and the region remained relatively placid. Chinese power, you remember they administered a lesson, served to restrain Hanoi's ambitions in Indochina, and U.S. strategic interests focused principally on assuring freedom of navigation not only in the Western Pacific and Indian Oceans, but the South China Sea as well. ASEAN reflected growing cohesion among its members. There were 5 at the time, but wider regional institutions were non-existent, and arms control agreements were rare. A U.S.-China communique regulating future arms transfers to Taiwan was concluded in August 1982, but over time it came to be honored more in the breach than in the observance. And Tokyo's defense policy, which was the most significant display of strategic restraint at the time, was a product not of international agreements, but of the government of Japan's own self-imposed restrictions. Overall, I'd say the military balance of forces was quite favorable from an American standpoint. We remained the dominant military power. Our allies were growing in strength. The credibility of our nuclear umbrella diminished local incentives to develop nuclear weapons. The possibility of conflict among the great powers seemed remote. Seventh Fleet protected the global commons. State-sponsored terrorism was a phenomenon largely confined to the Mediterranean and the Middle East. And for that matter, Asia was not even the dominant concern of the United States. The Reagan administration was principally concerned with Europe. If one goes fast forward, 30 years on, the East Asian strategic picture has changed fundamentally. The Soviet Union's gone. Russia plays only a modest role in the East Asian correlation of forces. It remains in the game primarily as a significant supplier of oil and other energy resources rather than as a major strategic force. China's dramatic rise has transformed it into a major power and a source of anxiety for some of its neighbors. Its post-Cold War political accommodation with Russia, was the Soviet Union, now Russia, reshaped the strategic equation. It removed a major rationale for Sino-American security cooperation. It permitted Beijing to redeploy its forces to the coastal and insular regions of China. As it developed a global trade and resource diplomacy, Beijing, quite understandably, was not inclined to leave their protection to the Seventh Fleet, and they have begun building a significant blue water navy for their protection. As its ability to project power over distance, at sea particularly, has increased, its capabilities now impinge much more directly on maritime Asia and American interests there. Hefty, sustained increases over 2 decades in China's defense budget have spurred a very impressive modernization of its military forces. It's acquiring capabilities designed to complicate U.S. options, limit U.S. options in Taiwan contingency, and to limit our access to areas close to China's shore. Beijing's military technology is also advancing across a very broad front. While its strength is no match for the United States as yet, I would say it's reemerged as Asia's strongest military power, and these days when Beijing talks, others increasingly pay heed. As intra-Asian trade has expanded at a brisker pace than trans-Pacific trade, China has supplanted the U.S. as the leading trade partner of every other Asian country. It is also becoming the world's largest exporter of most commodity, most merchandise, and China has acquired the largest stash as a result of foreign exchange reserves. This means essentially that our most plausible strategic competitor is now neck and neck with Japan as our largest foreign creditor. And many Asian countries, while still looking to Washington for protection, now benefit from greater economic interdependence with China. None wish to choose between their economic concerns and their strategic interests. Putting it in a shorthanded way, choose between Washington and Beijing. An element of strategic distrust now marks Sino-American relations. American officials and pundits frequently accuse Chinese of growing assertiveness. Chinese officials and their analysts routinely assert that America's pivot back to Asia constitutes a scarcely veiled effort to contain and weaken China. Both may hinge upon misperceptions, but they do influence debate and policy options considered in Washington and Beijing. While economic interdependence continues to grow, and the Sino-US relationship is not without many collaborative features, it seems to me the strategic dialogue between us is a little thin. There's lots of elaborate superstructure, but exchanges that often appear too formal, too bureaucratic, too ritualistic. Two key legacies of the Cold War in Asia now display increasingly divergent features. The Taiwan Strait is now more tranquil than at any time in my memory. Trade, investment, and tourism are flourishing. Taipei and Beijing have struck more than 15 agreements with one another, and their officials are in regular touch to assure their implementation. For the time being, the tough political issues have been finessed. On the Korean Peninsula, on the other hand, tensions have sharpened as Pyongyang has developed rudimentary nuclear weapons, tested missiles of lengthy range, and adopted a more belligerent posture toward the outside world. Since 2010, the North Koreans have carried out sneak attacks against the South, refused to return to the six-party talks, and indicated that their nuclear program is non-negotiable. At the same time, they remain a failing state, unable to feed all their own people, and unable to produce goods for export other than those that were produced in the Kaesong industrial complex, now apparently closed. North Korea presents no plausible existential threat to us, or for that matter, to its neighbors, but it does pose three other dangers. Its nuclear program could invite emulation by other Northeast Asian countries that are more financially capable and more technically proficient. An enlarged inventory of fissionable material might add incentives to transfer materials or technology to other countries, even non-state actors. Pyongyang, with a nuclear shield, might be emboldened to undertake new limited conventional assaults on its southern neighbor. At present, we appear limited to containing North Korea, yet cling to our proclaimed aim of denuclearizing the North. Meanwhile, Pyongyang strives to secure international acknowledgement of its nuclear status with the hope, presumably, of using it to drive a wedge between the U.S. and South Korea and between Washington and Tokyo. Following 2 decades of economic sluggishness, Japan's relative power in Asia has taken a serious hit, and its people have arguably become somewhat more inward-looking. But the Abe government has recently proclaimed that Japan's back, and indeed the parameters of Japan's defense policy and the nature of its relationship with the U.S. are undergoing some potentially powerful changes. China's recent steps to strengthen its claims to disputed islands in the East China Sea and North Korea's nuclear program have aroused fears in Japan that its territory is threatened for the first time in decades. The Diet recently approved the first increase in Japan's defense budget in 10 years. The government of Japan continues to amend self-imposed restrictions on its defense policy. Some Southeast Asian countries are now publicly urging Japan to play a larger role in promoting regional security, and Japan's defense ministry is expanding naval cooperation arrangements with countries in the region. While Japan and China's economies are increasingly intertwined, elements of strategic rivalry are clearly visible. Meanwhile, Asian regional institutions continue rapidly to proliferate, but they exert scant influence on security matters. Indeed, the ASEAN Regional Forum, whose charter comes closest to a security mandate, but which operates under a consensus principle, devotes much attention to such matters as piracy, pollution, and trafficking, but has little impact on other matters of greater, more urgent concern, such as military incidents in Korea or maritime disputes in the South or East China Sea. What are the drivers of this transformation? Clearly, China's rise, the growth of its economic and military power, and Beijing's evident determination to advance and protect its core interests are the single most dynamic factor. It is easy to exaggerate China's power and neglect its looming domestic problems, but surely Beijing is now the leading power in integrating the East Asian economy and altering the regional balance of forces. Over the past decade, its growing influence has been amplified by America's focus on terrorism, its preoccupation with costly, inconclusive wars in the Middle East and South Asia, and Japan's economic stagnation and diplomatic passivity, developments which have encouraged a misperception among many, particularly I think in China, that both nations are in decline. The expansion of China's Navy, its actions to contest administrative control of disputed islands in the South and East China Sea, and Pyongyang's relentless strive for nuclear weapons have provoked apprehensions among their neighbors, many of whom have accordingly urged the U.S., whether publicly or privately, to increase its own engagement in Asia. We have responded by acknowledging the heightened importance of the region and declaring our intent to invest more of our time, attention, and resources to it. This has served to reassure some while puzzling and worrying others. It has not as yet altered substantially the broad contours of our involvement in the region. Meanwhile, nationalism is thriving throughout East Asia and now trumps all competing ideologies. In some countries, this is fueled by success, in others by frustration, but it is heightening the intensity of regional disputes over resources and territory. It is encouraging rising defense budgets. It is reigniting conflicting historic memories as a factor in the relations among both allies and potential adversaries. Despite these developments, I think the likelihood of interstate conflict in Asia remains relatively low, and the scope of economic interdependence continues to rise. Still, I think I would have to say that compared to 1983, the strategic equation in East Asia, at least as viewed from our country, has become more complex, less favorable, and perhaps somewhat more dangerous. How do these developments affect our position? Undeniably, I think our relative power has diminished. The balance is more multipolar. Our ability to set the agenda or call the tune has declined. Our economic model and soft power has lost some luster. Our fiscal conditions are imposing a more frugal strategic posture on us. So we appear less capable and willing to pay the lion's share of the cost of public goods. All this notwithstanding, we do retain a very impressive military power. The boom in American production of natural gas and tight oil will improve our strategic position and give us wider options. The extrication of our forces from Middle East and South Asian conflicts will allow us to focus our time and attention and resources more carefully on a region of greater importance to us. And meanwhile, as China acquires global interests, it'll be forced to allocate its resources against a wider range of aims. Washington currently confronts two immediate challenges. North Korea's relentless pursuit of nuclear capabilities exposes the fact that our various policy efforts over the past several decades, whether relying on sanctions, affirmations of security assurances, offers of economic concessions, efforts to encourage regime change, or attempts to hand off the problem to Beijing, have yielded a lot more frustration than success. Second, the maritime disputes involving China and American allies and friends in Northeast and Southeast Asia present evident and perhaps increasing risks of confrontations or even conflicts due to accidents or miscalculation. They also present us with a very tricky dilemma because we have a very ambiguous policy stance. We assert neutrality as to the ultimate determination of sovereignty, yet include the Senkaku Islands within the ambit of our security commitment to Japan. The latter is based on Japan's long-time exercise of administrative control, which China is now openly contesting. There are also two overriding longer-term challenges. One involves the prudent management of American relations with a rising China. The other involves the encouragement of Japan, within the context of our alliance, to assume wider responsibilities for its self-defense and regional security, without alienating Beijing or nudging Tokyo across the nuclear threshold. I have some thoughts about these matters, but I think they'll be more appropriate in this afternoon's discussion, so I'll stop there.
All right. Thank you, Mike. And finally, Joshua Guang.
distinguished guests, and colleagues. This is really a special occasion to celebrate the 30 years APARC anniversary. And it also gives us a chance to really reflect on the tremendous changes in Asia and the Pacific region in the last 3 decades. And many of you are experts studying in this area. And some of you actually lived and studied there and worked there. So you really do not need me to tell you that Asian and Pacific countries have really evolved tremendously in the last 3 decades, economically, politically, and socially. It really has moved to the center of global society, partly because of economic prosperity, but partly because of the unsettling disputes among these countries. I don't think you need me to tell you that many countries in Asia now, especially Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and China, are moving now into an aging society. And that will change the domestic dynamics and put tremendous pressures on the public goods provision, on social welfare, healthcare, old age support, as well as the sources to fund these demands. And I don't need to tell you that Asia, at this moment, really is in the middle of dilemma. On the one hand, it has, over the last 2 decades or 3, has reduced the poverty level from over 80% to about now 50%. But on the other hand, social inequality in Asian countries has risen over the last 3 decades. The Gini coefficients that measure the extent of income inequality has risen from 39% to an alarming 46% today. And this surely is likely to generate tensions and confrontations among social groups, among ethnic groups, between citizens and their governments, and problems between the states. But on the brighter side, over the years, we have witnessed really a tremendous increase in the border crossings among the peoples in Asian societies. And with border crossing, and there's increased shared values and mutual understanding. I think that's where the future of Asia lies. So instead of discussing about these changes, tremendous changes here and there, I want to really discuss and drawing on my own experience, personal experience and observations, to see how these changes are reflected on this campus. I came to Stanford as a PhD student in 1984, the second year after the APARC was founded. And at that time, Japan was the second largest economy in the world. And I remember I took a course with Professor Aoki. I remember Professor Aoki told me that when he first offered this course at Stanford during that time, there's only a dozen of students showed up. But very soon, that class grew to over 100 students and more. And at that time, I came across readings by professors here, talking about the political economy of Japan and the 4 Asian tigers. Among the 4 Asian tigers, at that time, 2 were under military rule, South Korea and Taiwan. In my cohort, we have 2 Korean students, and they became my office mates. So we hang out together and become really good friends. They came with their family, and I was a bachelor at that time. So I was frequently invited to go to their home in Escondido Village to have dinner with them. And over these long discussions, they have been telling me about stories of social movements in Korea and their frustrations and resentment of the military government at home. So I was not surprised when one student, Kim Young-sung, decided to choose social movement as his research field and work with Larry Diamond to do his dissertation on this topic. So a few years later, we all graduated. Kim Young returned to Korea to take a position in a college. And many years later, as we all know, Korea underwent transition from military rule to democracy. And I heard that Kim Young-sung became what's called the presidential secretary for policy affairs. a minister level position and a direct elected president. So in a small way, I think Stanford contributed to this transition. In the early 1980s, Taiwan was also under military rule. At that time, I remember that students from mainland China and students from Taiwan, we do not socialize together. We did not socialize. Given the political reasons and historical legacies, there were deep suspicions and mistrust between these two student bodies. But everything has changed during the weeks and months around June 1989. Chinese students on this campus organized many activities in support of students' protests in Tiananmen Square, and Taiwanese students, actually engineers in Silicon Valley, all joined in. I remember there were discussions and meetings and activities every week, every evening at Escondido Village Community Center. And the barriers and distance among these social groups just simply disappeared. And as we all know, Taiwan underwent a transition to democracy in the 1980s and went through a pretty bumpy and at times turbulent road, but by now really becomes a model democracy in Asia with a very special appeal to many in mainland China. And as we know, telecommunication technologies, many invented here in Silicon Valley, has played a major role in border crossing and communication across societies in Asia. But there was a time when communication was very expensive and cumbersome and had to go through international long-distance calls and post office mails. I remember vividly one episode in around 1986. At that time, graduate students had to go to their department, to the computer clusters to do their work. So in a very crowded computer cluster room, we were all busy at work when suddenly a Japanese student exclaimed and literally jumped out of her chair. And he said, I sent out an email to Japan, to a friend of mine in Japan just a moment ago, and now I got a reply. This was the first time I heard about email, and many of us heard about email. And of course, the rest is history. But the rest is not history. With technologies, internet communications, and people really can communicate, share information and their values across these cultural boundaries in Asia and beyond. And along with this border crossing, there came, I think, shared values, tolerance, and understanding. Many of you heard about the anti-Japanese demonstrations, in some cases violence in Chinese cities last year, triggered by this island dispute. And there were many nasty messages floating on the internet. But among all these noises, the internet also provided some glimpse of the calmer and more hopeful side. I remember that at the height of these demonstrations, there were bloggers, Chinese bloggers, actually pointedly make a statement. They are traveling to Japan and they want to be different. And I remember there's one story posted on the internet by a Chinese tourist who went to Japan at that time. And during that period of time, the TV news in Japan reported on the protests and violence in the Chinese streets all the time. So the Chinese tourists were really worried about their personal safety in Japan. So one evening, they had a dinner in a restaurant. Toward the end of that dinner, the chef or the owner came out to ask the tourists if they were from the mainland China. And they said yes, and the chef asked them to wait. So this tourist group became really nervous. They didn't know what would happen to them. So after a while, the chef and several waiters came out and with a beautiful cake. On that cake, it says, "Thank you for visiting Japan in this difficult time." So this simple story with a picture taken and put it on the internet, I think speaks louder than many other nasty words on the internet. In recent years, many students from Asia came to study at Stanford. and through Stanford, actually build connections and access to other Asian cultures. And for example, Stanford provides internship in Asia. And then many of us faculty members at APARC, I know Dan, I know Jane, we're all involved in the interview and the selection process that sending these students to different positions in Asia. And I was involved in this process as well. I was very pleased to see that students are very adventurous, trying to be different, to go to a different place to learn the new culture. I remember one case last year, a female student from Myanmar. She looked very young. She wore traditional clothes. And she wanted to go to Beijing to do her intern. But what is interesting is that she wants to do intern in Samsung, the Korean company in Beijing. So think about the border crossing that from Myanmar to Stanford to Beijing and then to Samsung in Beijing. And the officer in charge of the internship looked at the job description from Samsung and tried to warn her, said, the firm requires long working hours, sometimes there's no weekend. You should be serious about, think hard about whether you want to take on this job or not. And she looked into our eyes and said calmly that when I grew up, I looked after my sister's brothers and helped my parents take care of their business. I am sure I can meet this challenge. I think it is this kind of perseverance, open-mindedness, and a border-crossing attitude that gives hope to a brighter future in Asian societies. And also you know that Stanford and APARC has played a very important role in this process. So we are all very proud. Thank you.